Thank you for that introduction, and I want to thank CLPR for the invitation to present. I also want to sort of acknowledge the strangeness of a non-Pakistani presenting on the recent Pakistan Act, and I think as we're all aware in this room, visa regimes between India and Pakistan don't readily allow Pakistanis to travel here and vice versa, and I hope that we can all work towards a situation in a world where there are more open borders, including in the US. So I've been coming to India and Pakistan for work and research and to see friends and family for almost 20 years now. And in India, I've done research projects concerning Islamic legal institutions and Muslim personal law. And in Pakistan, I've done research historically on constitutional discussions there, and in particular the incorporation of Islam into Pakistani constitutional decisions. I've, in the past 5 years, started doing research on transgender rights issues in Pakistan, and I actually think that this is a natural outgrowth of all my other areas of interest, and I can maybe try to link all of this together at the end. But I just wanted to put that biography out there and suggest that both my lived history and also I think the history of the region and the history of these issues are intersectional ones, and we would be well served to think about the intersectionality of both India and Pakistan, but also gender identity questions with issues of religious identity questions. Okay, so my focus is on the 2018 Act. I'm going to be quick and not go over my time. What I will say is I think that for many people, both in this region and globally, it was maybe a bit of a surprise that Pakistan passed the Pakistan Transgender Protection of Rights Act in 2018. And I think it was maybe even a further surprise, there's just been a series of surprises around Pakistan's actions on this front. And this goes back to as early as 2009 when litigation was brought at the Pakistan Supreme Court concerning the social rights and social welfare situation of trans people, and maybe more specifically trans women in Pakistan. So this started in Pakistan, at least in the contemporary moment, in 2009 when there was a police raid on a wedding party that was happening in Rawalpindi, which as many of you know is a large Punjabi city outside the capital city of Islamabad. And there were several people who were arrested at this party, including about 4 or 5 trans women, and there were protests outside of led by members of the community outside the police station where they were being held. They were eventually released. But in this period of time, also a relatively well-known advocate by the name of Dr. Muhammad Aslam Khaki brought a public interest or human rights litigation in the Pakistan Supreme Court saying, this police abuse that we are seeing in Rawalpindi is just the tip of the iceberg, and there are many other problems with how this Republic of Pakistan has, and society of Pakistan more broadly has treated trans people in Pakistan. So the court heard, there's no decision like the Nalsa decision that you can point to easily in Pakistan as the Pakistan decision on transgender rights. What happened in Pakistan, there are some decisions that are out there in the public record, but there were many hearings, ongoing hearings that the Supreme Court held from 2009 to 2012, in which they called and gathered both members of different trans communities from around the country, different government departments, and other people who had relevant knowledge or experience, and the court drafted orders after each one of these hearings, and it really was just sort of this constant supervisory sort of role that the court took on. Now, I have gathered most of these orders, and hopefully with working with CLPR, these can be made more public. But let me just say that there were kind of 4 major interests that the Supreme Court of Pakistan had over these 3 years. The first issue, and this is 2009 was an important time in Pakistan. It was really a period when the country was transitioning from the Musharraf dictatorship to, again, back to a more democratic form of governance. So the court was really interested in claims that people were making that they could not vote. And they were being denied the right to vote by electoral officials, that when they would show up to the polling station, the people, supervising the polling station would say, there's something fishy. Either you don't have an ID, you don't have a national identity card, or your picture doesn't match, your current appearance, or we don't, this is the gender of someone else other than you. We think that you're engaging in fraudulent attempts at voting. So lots of trans people were being denied the right to vote, and so the court was really concerned with that. They're also really concerned with the lack of access to national identity cards. And this is the predicate of voting, right? You need a national identity card in Pakistan to vote in national elections. So identity cards are really important. They're also really interested in inheritance rights, and they're really interested in the stories that different trans people brought to court and told them about their situation, their childhood situation when they were thrown out of their home, and as a result, they were not only left homeless until a guru took them in or some other person took them in, but then also they had no access to the property of their family when their parents, assuming they knew who their parents were, and died, that their siblings sort of continued this, system of banishment and would not allow them to access their family property through the inheritance laws. Okay, so the court issued a bunch of opinions in 2009 to 2012. Fast forward to 2017, and there was lots of different government departments trying to respond to the court's many orders saying that you have to do things better, you have to listen to people, you have to work with people, you have to work with the community, you have to improve their situation. The next major sort of litigation that happened was in 2017 around the national census in Pakistan. And petitions were filed in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province in the northwest of Pakistan, the Islamabad High Court, and the Lahore High Court. And petitioners were saying, we're not going to be counted in the national census, and we're supposed to be considered full citizens now, and so you have to count us. You have to create a special column for us in the gender category. And eventually, people won those cases. And this goes back to a discussion yesterday about disability and gender. Simultaneously, there were disability rights activists bringing similar cases saying, you're not counting us. And this got consolidated, these two issues, counting disabled persons or differently abled persons and counting transgender persons, got consolidated in the different courts' minds. And so actually the scheme, thinking about who is the third gender, the Lahore High Court came up with a scheme where in the column for gender, there were now, the census officials were supposed to put 1 down if it was a man that they were counting, 2 down if it was a woman that they were counting, the number 3 down if it was a transgender person that they were counting, number 4 down if it was a male disabled person, number 5 if it's female disabled, and number 6 as transgender disabled. Okay, so that, the census was sort of a disaster for, I think, the trans community. The census officials, they just looked at people's national identity cards, many of which had not been updated. And so ultimately they only counted 10,000 trans people in the entirety of Pakistan, which has 208 million people according to the 2017 census, and of which only 10,000. Okay, so now the 2018 Act. If you go, it's in your packet, and I encourage everyone to look at it. I'll skim through it. I think the 3 really important aspects of it are the definition of transgender, which is a very umbrella definition. It includes, rightly or wrongly, and I think many people have many different opinions about this, but it includes intersex people within the category of transgender. It also uses the term of eunuch, which circulated throughout the Supreme Court hearings in 2009, 2012, and which Pakistan can't seem to get away from this kind of colonial terminology. But then it also used quite contemporary terms, transgender man, transgender woman, and this more historical term, khwaja sira, which is maybe the most polite term that's used in Pakistani society. So there's a really expansive definition of transgender. This act works to protect the issuance of ID cards, and ID cards have become a central point of conflict and rights, actually, in Pakistan. Again, you need this national identity card in order to be able to vote, in order to be able to register at educational institutions, et cetera. So it says to the state, you have to issue identity cards to people based on their self-declared gender. I think it's fairly clear. There's no real wavering on this. So it's very much self-definition. It also, works to protect people's voting rights, but the identity card issue then gets linked to inheritance rights, and Section 7 is a very expansive section on inheritance rights, and I think this is an aspect of the Pakistani discussion which is different than the Indian discussion. I am learning through talking to people that there are cases that have been litigated in India in which the inheritance system is predicated on people's gender, and then there are conflicts over whether someone is being counted as the right gender. This Section 7 is trying to say, okay, there's this Islamic inheritance system. Sometimes your gender matters for the purposes of inheritance within Islamic inheritance law, not always. But when it matters, usually a male relation gets twice as much as a female relation with a corresponding obligation to care for or provide for the female relation. This is how we're going to understand the term male, female, and also non-male, non-female for the purposes of transgender. And it's largely predicated on self-definition. Again, it's what your identity card says, and your identity card is, the gender listed there is supposed to be what you declare. So that's a really interesting aspect of the Act. Let me just close quickly by identifying three what I think are sort of three outstanding issues. One, we don't really know what self-identification means for the purposes of this Act, and I think this is also an issue that's lurking within the Indian discussion from what I can tell. So self-identification can take lots of different forms. So it can be, you're given three choices, male, female, X, choose one of them. It could also be, you get to write your gender, whatever it is and however you call it, on your identity card. You get to name yourself in some sense. You get to name your own gender. And it could also be some sort of more intermediate option in which there's 5 gender options, and arguably, someone can ask me about this, but after the Supreme Court's intervention in 2009, for a while the Pakistan government was giving people 5 different gender options to choose from for their national identity cards. So self-identification, it's not self-defining. We need to think more about what we mean by self-identification. I'll also say there's a lurking question about the inheritance law. The Act is trying to set out an Islamic inheritance law, but not everyone in Pakistan is Muslim. Not every transgender person is Muslim. So should this Islamic inheritance system be applied to non-Muslim transgender people? The Act says this inheritance scheme applies to all transgender people, and it doesn't mention or suggest the existence of non-Muslim transgender people in Pakistan. Maybe it's better than any Christian transgender inheritance system. Maybe it's better than any Hindu. I don't know, but it's something to definitely talk about. And then finally, if gender is according to self-choice, how do we deal with marriage? What does Section 377 mean anymore in the Pakistan context? These are all left unaddressed by the Act. So I'll just end there. But thank you, everyone.